and be ready. I'm going to try to summarize about a decade of research and multiple different publications in only a couple minutes. So there's going to be a lot flying at you and a lot of visualizations come your way. So if you could pause the chat and focus in, that'd be great. So let's get started. So from really enormous, devastating hurricanes to the more recently well-known encompassing the wildfires, to even the most recently kind of big thing that we've been talking about in our country of these seasonal floods, we can no longer deny that climate change is having enormous implications on our communities. Moreover, it is increasingly clear that those that are racially and socioeconomically marginalized experience extreme devastation and are left with much less after disasters. For many years, scholars and nonprofits have explained this inequality by simply suggesting that disasters reveal inequality. In other words, inequality is there, it's across the country, it's everywhere, and when disasters come, everyone just kind of loses. But because we can see it more now, because everyone's lost, we reveal or we understand that this inequality is here. This perspective leads to what I would call a compassionate response, and this desire to say, okay, these people need necessities, let's make sure they have them. Yet this notion that disasters are purely revealing inequality is not actually empirically substantiated. When I first started to recognize this inconsistency in the literature, again, this was several years ago now, I started to figure out, okay, well, how can we actually empirically see if that's happening? Specifically, could we actually compare people who are living across the country and experiencing the inequality that is just vast in our country, but compare them across if they've experienced disasters or not, and see how that might be impacting the implications. So to do this, I use, and this is again, a series of different papers that I'm summarizing quickly here, but I use a random sample of the entire US in order to be able to compare people who are really similar on demographics. They live in racially and socioeconomically similar places, but some have experienced disasters and others have not. Using this kind of statistical isolation, I've been able to examine people both across time, so over a decade of observations is what I'm going to show you today, as well as those who move across the country, which is extremely important, especially when we're talking about climate change and disasters, because people move because of these things. I've also looked at this across all sorts of outcomes, and my work is fairly easy to access if you're interested in some other outcomes. But today I want to focus on wealth. And by wealth, I don't mean wealthy. I'm using the social science way of using this word, which is the can't say that word right now. The summing or the adding of all of one's assets. So your bank account, your property, if you have it, all those kind of things, minus one's debt. So anything from a mortgage to school loans, credit card debt, etc. So this kind of broad conception of wealth is so important because as a social scientist, we know it impacts everything else, your health, your well-being, your housing, all these kind of things. And so when we actually looked at this outcome for people who did and didn't experience disasters, we started to find some really surprising results. So first of all, just to even further clarify what I'm doing here, I'm comparing people who are really similar on all those things I kind of threw up demographic wise, but also they had the exact same wealth in 1999. So they're equally as rich, if you will. And some lived through a lot of disasters over the decade and some did not. And to our surprise, the first thing that we found is those who lived through disasters actually ended our time period with more money than their counterparts, so the same people that serve the same amount of wealth that didn't live through the disasters. In other words, the disasters themselves were making them wealthier. First of all, not what we would expect, definitely not what we expected as researchers, probably not what you expect as people who've lived and maybe have experienced others living through disasters. And so we want to know, well, how much and who is this happening for? So first of all, just like mathematically, we actually can create that baseline by saying, okay, the people who lived under quote unquote normal conditions, which we can question if that's normal aside in the discussion, but those who didn't live through disasters, how much wealth did their wealth increase by? We'll use that as our actual mathematical baseline. And then we'll say, okay, what's the difference? And once we find that difference, we can actually graph it and say the amount of inequality that's different is the amount or wealth that we can account towards the disaster itself, holding everything else constant. And again, as you might expect, this disaster wealth growing potential isn't the same for everyone. When we look across educational attainment, we see those who graduated from college have gained a lot more wealth then again, this baseline would be college-educated people who are not living in disasters. So those who are college-educated living through disasters are gaining wealth, and they're also gaining more wealth than their neighbors who are less educated. A similar story is true when we look across homeownership and renting. But when the story actually starts to get very interesting is when we look across race, particularly if we intersect race with other forms of socioeconomic inequality, and we see from this intersectional perspective, white privileged residents are actually gaining a lot of wealth. Again, this is more than their white privileged counterparts not living through disasters. So even comparing those two groups, but more importantly, those residents of color, and particularly those who are also disadvantaged across other socioeconomic axes, are losing wealth. Another way to visualize or think about this is to think about it over time. In this graph, what you see is the darker colors are the people who've lived through more disasters, and their wealth is growing faster and more. Most surprising is that green line on the top, which is actually FEMA aid, which is suggesting that counties that receive more FEMA aid actually are making their white residents richer. Unfortunately, and was probably not surprising at this moment since I've showed you these other graphs, Black residents and other residents of color are experiencing the complete opposite. In other words, disasters, and in particular, FEMA aid is actually creating some of this inequality. It's not just revealing it, it's actually making it happen. Moreover, this is not just governmental aid, it's also nonprofit aid. Particularly, we examine this by looking at counties that both experience disasters. So now we're just looking at disasters. And we also hold constant some other things about non-disaster counties. But for conceptually right now, just think about comparing two areas that have experienced similar disasters, but some have a lot of nonprofits, a lot of churches, a lot of other religious communities, and others do not. And unfortunately, and very depressingly, we find that when communities have a lot of nonprofits, their poverty actually goes up. In other words, nonprofits, and specifically faith-based groups that are focused on compassionate relief, actually lead to increased levels of poverty after disasters than counties that have had the same amount of disaster and haven't had those reliefs. So why is this the case? Obviously, this is super multifaceted and there's lots of components, and I'm happy to share more of the specifics that we've found in our research in the question and answer. But I want to posit for you today that one of the key reasons that this is the case is because our focus on compassionate relief without advocating for larger change is reifying the same notions that have created the inequality in the first place. Oftentimes, we think about all of these components, particularly from a religious perspective and then from a Christian perspective, as compassionate relief versus transformation. And to be clear, both are called for in communities of faith, and both are really important. But I would argue that in the American church, we're much more comfortable staying in our compassionate bubble and making sure that we're getting to people who we think are the most disadvantaged by the situations we see, instead of actually advocating to transform the principalities and powers, if you will, that are perpetuating these very inequalities. So with that, I will pass it off and we can get more into some of these details during the question and answer.